Hello, this is Mottzy back with another Mottzy Minutes. Today I'm going to teach you about menus in Smile Game Builder. Before I get started, I want to show you what I'm talking about. You see here I have a menu of characters that you could select. I have a select box, and I have the ability to select each of these faces and show an avatar of that character on the right hand side of the screen. I get a fancy background of graphics, and I have a fancy background of a small game builder scene used to make this menu work. Now I teased a bit of this menu on my last Mottzy Minute, which specifically was on how to use key inputs. This time I'm going to show you how to take key inputs and turn it into a menu like so. So let's open this up and take a look under the hood. Before we get started, I just want to show you quickly some of the elements that go into making this menu. You can see here I have my map character selection menu, and I have all of the characters laid out on the map, spaced out about 6 tiles. Now I'm not going to go over exactly how to get the character display to work. That will be in part 2 of this tutorial, simply because there's so much content I want to break this apart to make it easier to digest. But you can see that the menu really is just a set of characters laid out on the screen, and then I find a way to use camera angles to show them as if they were part of a different display. For this Mottzy Minute, we're actually going to look at just how to get a menu to display on the screen at all, and then how to make key presses allow us to navigate around on that menu for display. There's a lot that goes into this, so look in the description below if you want to jump ahead to individual parts of this tutorial. So first we're going to start looking at the common events that go into this structure. You can see I have a lot of different common events. This isn't required to make the code work, but it does make it more manageable, and since I want this to be usable by more people than just myself, and it will be available in my MakerBase SGB project, I wanted to break this apart to make it maintainable and easier to modify. So this menu has multiple components. First we have MenuCharacter. This is the main rendering display of the menu and the thing that handles the key inputs. MenuCharacterPlacer is responsible for putting the faces of the characters on the screen. MenuRenderSelectBox is responsible for handling updating the select box that shows surrounding a menu character. MenuCharacterSetup is actually what I use to set up some of the main values necessary to make the menu display. Menu display selection is what is used to show the characters in the background, and this is one that will be covered in a follow-up tutorial. And finally, MenuCharacterConfirm and MenuCharacterClose deal with either selecting a character or escaping the menu. We'll start by looking at MenuCharacterSetup. You can see here that my event has a number of notes just to help you as the developer understand more what each of these variables is intended to do. You can see, for instance, that I have character size, which is specific to the number of characters I want to show. Menu character X and Y have to deal with where the menu characters start being rendered from on the XY coordinates on the screen. Then we have the menu character increment values, X and Y. This is how much space we put between the menu character renders. Then we have menu character columns. This is actually a really important setting. This dictates how many faces that get put across a row. So when I have 4, there'll be 4 faces going across the screen, and then it will wrap around and put the rest of the faces below. These settings for the select box just indicate where the graphic for the select box shows, and you can see that I actually have it at 43 and 43. That's so that it is properly centered around the character selection box. And then finally, this menu select mode is a way to control how you want the selection box to work when you are selecting characters on the screen. For this Mottzy Minutes, it's really simple, and I only use one setting, but conceivably you can have other settings down the road if you want to do something more advanced. You'll notice that this is set up as trigger from another event, because when I make the menu render is when I want to call this, and you'll see that in one of my other events. Next, we're going to look at the menu character. Now, this does end up calling a bunch of other events, but this is where everything gets kicked off. So we'll take a look at this event and break down how it works so you have a better understanding of how you'd render a menu on the screen. The first thing we have to do is we have to check for key input. This may not be needed. The type of character menu I'm showing may not need user input for it to show. However, if you wanted a menu that gets brought up by the character when you're on screen, this is how you would do it. You would capture the key input of the cancel button or any other button you wanted, and then you would proceed to kick off the menu. This display image was added near the end of my construction of this example to create a background to the menu. This may not be placed in the right slot, and I might actually move this to another place within the menu structure so that it's easier to modify. My ideal world would be if you were to get this code, you wouldn't want to modify this event at all. Maybe if you want to do some slight adjustments, but ideally this would be something that just works and all you have to do is change the inputs. So likely this will get moved somewhere else. But it was a way to create a background for the menu faces to make it look a little better than just seeing a plain transparent background. The next thing I do is I disable both camera control and player control. This isn't strictly necessary because anytime you override a key press, it will technically disable the behaviors like camera and player control, but this is a nice safety net to ensure that you can't accidentally miss some key press and get a weird result on your screen. And then finally you see here I use run common event. This gets used a lot. This lets me call another common event that I want to trigger at some point in my script. There's also this checkbox that says wait until destination event completes. You may or may not care about whether this is checked. I wanted to make sure the character setup completed before we moved on, so I checked this box so this script will execute before anything else happens. And this is where we get started with the main portion of the algorithm. The first thing I need to do is assign 0 to this thing I call MenuCharacterIndex. This index represents the character that is going to be placed on the screen. Then I get to do my loop. And while I considered doing a diagram that shows how this loop works, it isn't quite as complicated as a sorting algorithm. It just uses some mathematical tricks to get a good grid layout of our characters. You'll also notice that I use run common event to shorten the amount of code that I have to look at when managing this loop. So the loop has an escape clause down here, but if the escape doesn't happen, I'm able to call this render on each loop. We'll look at the main character placer in a moment, but this is where the meat of the loop happens. Now I just noticed I left a hard-coded value here to say when the loop ends. To make it a little easier to move forward, I'm going to fix this real quick and then I'll explain what I did. Now that we have this fixed, I'll explain how it works. As you may have saw from the setup script, I had the ability to set what the menu character size is, which was 12 in my case. So I need to do a comparison between the menu character size and the menu character index. So first I have to set some variable and then subtract the index from that. That's how I get a comparison between the two. So since I don't really need to do much with this, it's a throwaway variable, I just use local variable 0. I subtract menu character index from menu character size, and then if the contents are less than or equal to 1, then we're going to escape the loop. This is super important, less than or equal to 1, because we use a 0-based index for the character index, but for size, we give a solid number like 12. So size represents 12 characters, menu character index, it would actually be 0 to 11. So if I've already rendered the 11th character and I subtract 11 from 12, I should end up with 1 or less. And then I would escape this loop and move on to the next section of the menu. If the menu needs to keep moving forward, I need to somehow calculate where the next XY coordinates will be for the placement of the character. So the first thing I have to do is I have to add 1 to the character index. Then I have to set up this thing I call MenuCharacterCheck. This is what I'm going to use to decide exactly what I'm doing next with my values. So the first thing I do is I put the index into that check. Then I use this interesting thing called substitute divided remainder variable box. This is an interesting calculation. It's like doing division, but what you get at the end is the remainder that doesn't get evenly divided into a number. This is a really neat mathematical concept, but it can be confusing at times. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a note panel so I can at least briefly explain exactly how this works. The modular calculation can be a little confusing, but what you have is you have an expression and a modulus. The expression will be the number that we're using to count the character index. So let's say that the character index is 6. The modulus is the number of columns. In this case, it will be 4. So the way this works is a modulus calculation will take the number here, which is the modulus, and attempt to divide the expression. Now we know that we can divide 6 by 4 one time evenly. And what we're left after that is the number 2, which is the remainder of that division. So if I subtract 4 from 6, I get 2. 2 is the remainder that you would get as the integer left over from a division. This also works if the number on the left was 2, and I did 2 mod 4. I cannot divide 2 by 4. So 2 cannot be divided by 4. That means the remainder is 2, because there is no division that can happen. So when I put a number that's smaller than the modulus, I just get that number back. If I put a number that's larger than the modulus, I get the modulated version. And this works as high as those numbers can possibly go. And what it means is that 4 becomes a gate. It doesn't allow that character index to be any greater than 3. And the reason is, if I were to have 4 mod 4, I would get 0 as my result. And that's because 4 can be divided by 4 evenly, and there's no remainder. If this is confusing, you can check out the website, which I'll put here at Planet Calc, which gives you a modular calculator and lets you test out how it might work. The real trick is we shorten the number of things we have to do to make a gridded list, because I can use the modulus to make the columns reset every time it hits 4. So we substitute the divided remainder into MenuCharacter check, and then we do this increment. This increment for x happens on every loop, and it's whatever increment we decided. In this case, it was 100, so we add 100 to the character x. This is the x coordinate on the screen for the character portrait. Then the next thing I need to do is the check on the character check. When this equals 0, it means that the menu character index is 4. Now we already talked about the fact that this is 0 as the starting point. So the character index numbers are 0, 1, 2, 3, and that gets you 4 character portraits across the top. So if this equals 0, we need to do a reset. And a reset means we reset the character x value, and then we increment the y value. Now again, I notice I have a sign 50 here. That's a hard-coded number. So what I need to do to fix this is I need to make this use an assignment from a preset value in my settings. So I'll fix that now so it's clear on the tutorial. Okay, we're back. And so what I realized was, because I didn't really want to make a whole new variable just to store this value that gets used this one time, what I did at the top here is I added a local variable which I set to MenuCharacterX before we start changing that x value. And then on each of these loops where I have to reset it, I just set the local variable to MenuCharacterX, which effectively resets it back to the initial setting. This is the bulk of the loop, and it will get you a rendered grid of whatever you configured as your size. But now we need to see how this is going to render. So we need to take a look at execute common event MenuCharacterPlacer to see what happens in there. So this is the MenuCharacterPlacer. You can see that this is triggered from another event, and it's actually quite simple. All I have is a number of check statements. In fact, I have 12 of them, and they just check for the character index and renders the appropriate character at the current XY coordinates. So you can see I have 0 through 11, which matches the 0 base index I talked about in the beginning. And then I have to select each image and then place them by the variable x, y. And that's it. Now you may be wondering where this character portrait came from. And what I did was I took the character portraits that exist in Smile Game Builder by default, and I cut their heads out to make them a little bit more manageable for the menu I was trying to make. I used a tool called Sprite. That's not part of this tutorial, and it's actually pretty simple to do. So I might cover a tutorial later on how to do the cutout of the character images, but it's not super important. As long as you have some images you can import into the system, you can get them to display however you'd like them to. If you have more than 11 items, you'll have to add additional checkboxes here, and you'll also have to adjust the main setup variables so that you say the size is larger than 12. So what the event is going to do is, based upon whatever index gets supplied, it will just render one image. This is kind of a cool trick. If you have an event sheet like this, and you have some variable like MenuCharacterIndex, then as long as you feed it a variable that matches the character you want to display, it will just display whatever variable it is at the XY coordinates you specify. That's literally all this event does. Finally, for this Mottzy Makes, we'll look both at how the character selection happens and how it gets rendered using this SelectBox event. So first we'll go back to MenuCharacter, and you'll see here at the bottom, once I have finished this loop, now I have to set up to allow key input. So I set or reset a bunch of variables so they're ready for the select box to work. You can see here I have select column and select row. This is the column and row coordinates of the select box. And we have column check and row check. This is part of the way I test whether the character selection box can actually move in the direction you're pressing. And then we reset the character index. This is actually going to be part of part 2 of our tutorial, where we show a character on the screen equivalent to the one that is selected. Finally, one of our setup values indicated how many columns we were going to use in our menu. We also have to be able to calculate how many rows are available for display. And so we do that by setting the character size to rows, and then we divide menu character columns from what we have as a character size, which will give us character rows. Finally, we do want the select box to be rendered in its initial state, so we do this display image of the select box at the XY coordinates. I didn't talk about this earlier, but this does remind me that each of the images I display, even the character images, need a different image display number. So this is 109, and all the other portraits are 110 on up to 121, I believe. And then to make this event sheet go away, I turn this event switch on, which is MenuCharacterSelectOpen. You can see on the left-hand side, I both have to have this switch MenuCharacterSelect, which allows the menu to work at all. And then I have to have MenuCharacterSelectOpen as off in order for me to do the initial rendering. When it gets switched to on, we switch to the Select Menu tab. As you can see here, these are both on. And this is where we do the repeated cycle of listening for key input and responding to it. And that's really all of this event sheet is. It's just listening for key input and calling another event in response. You can see here we have the closed menu. I've put notes on each one of these. If the cancel button is hit, which is the escape key, then we will execute the MenuCharacterClose common event. If the spacebar is pressed, which is confirm, then we do the confirm event. For both of these ones, I use 2, which means it happens immediately when you start pressing the keys. Then we get down to listening to all of the arrow key presses. Now I notice I missed a note, so I'm going to add that now so that we have it in our documentation. So this is going to handle all of the arrow key presses, which will move the select box on the screen. You can see key up, key down, key left, key right. I only do one thing for each one of these. I either subtract or add to the row check or the column check, depending on the direction. So if it's up, I subtract from the row check. If it's down, I add to the row check. If it's left, I subtract from column check. If it's right, I add to the column check. And each one of these calls the exact same event, MenuRenderSelectBox. This is what's responsible for determining whether the select box can render and how to render it on the screen. Let's take a look at that. This is responsible for handling all the events that get triggered for the menu, and it's really just kind of a controller of responding to and sending events elsewhere. You may also notice that this is automatically start, synchronize, and repeated. So I have been switching between using automatically start, synchronize, and repeated versus using call from other events. It really depends on the behavior you want. If you want to wait for something to be called, you use no trigger execute from another event. But if you want to be checking for things like keys, you usually have to use automatically start, synchronize, and repeated. Let's go take a look at MenuRenderSelectBox. So this event has two main components to it. The first thing it has to do is a check to see whether the check values for row and column can actually be applied to the select box. And then it has to actually render the select box. This is not very complicated logic, and it actually just does a series of chain checkboxes to make sure that the values fall within given parameters. So going left, that means on the column going left, 0 is the number we use. We want to make sure that it is greater than or equal to 0. If we were going to go up, which means we're subtracting from the row, we also want to make sure that that value is 0. The next set of checks require a little bit more logic because we have to do a comparison based upon the number of columns or the number of rows we have available. So previously we have defined character columns and we have defined menu character rows. So just like before, we assign this to a local variable and then we subtract the character column check. And if that value is greater than 0, it means that we're safe to move on to the next step. Now I use a little bit of a logical trick here. What I do is I turn this local switch to off. This local switch decides whether we can actually apply the values of row and column check to move the select box. And then only if every single one of these checkboxes succeed can I turn that switch on, because this means that the values I'm trying to set can actually be set on the character select screen. Once I get down here to the bottom, then I just check if this value is on or not. If it's on, I can safely set the values of select column check and row check to menu character select column and menu character select row. If that fails, then I actually want to reset the values of those check, row, and column. So I take menu character select column and row and I set them back over the values. That will prevent the select box from moving at all. Now again, I noticed that as I'm going through this code, I left a little bit of artifacts from when I was debugging. I'm going to remove this. I originally thought that there was some issue with the local switch being turned off, but as you can see, at the beginning of each check, we already turned that local switch off, so there's no way that this will accidentally fall through. The next phase of this menu is setting up the character index for when we have select something and we want to be able to confirm our selection. Again, this will be part of part 2, but there's just some math here, so I make sure the menu character index is correct. And finally, we render the box. Just like our initial setup loop, we just do some basic math to get the character X and character Y coordinates set correctly, and then we use this move graphic command in order to set the graphic of 109, which is our select box, to the character X and character Y coordinates. Now we are reusing character X and Y, and the reason for that is we only use character X and Y as part of the initial menu setup. So it's safe to reuse this for the select box movement since we only use it in one place. The final thing I do here is I add a wait. This is sort of necessary because if there is not a wait here, the movement of the keys would be very fast and hard to control. So the wait provides a little bit of a pause between each movement of the select box, assuming that you're holding the keys down. This is actually something interesting here. So earlier on I showed you that I use 2 here for the setting, which means the first time the key is pressed. The difference between 2 and 1 with key input is that 2 will only fire 1 time on the initial key press. 1 will be considered held down. So if you're holding down a key and you want to keep performing an action, you want to check for 1. But it happens so fast that if you don't put a wait like I do in the menu character select row check, you will result in super fast movement that's hard to control. So now we've done a full walkthrough of the code used to display the menu. Let's do another demo and talk through really quickly some of those components. So as all the MakerBase SGB maps work, I have to go enable this functionality first. So I'm going to turn it on. And now that it's on, I can hit the escape key. Uh-oh. Looks like we have a bug in our code. So we'll fix this real quick so we can get this rendering properly. Now, I didn't change a lot of this code during my tutorial, but we did touch some code within this loop. And what you might notice here is that when I set up this comparison, I forgot to do one important step. And that is, while I have the variable box I'm using in this advanced variable op, I need to do a subtraction, not an assignment. So if you were cringing earlier about my little mistake, I did want to show it instead of hiding it because I do tend to record these tutorials in one go. So there you go. I made a mistake. Yes, Mottzy is human. I know that's surprising. So let's move on and we'll show you how this should work. We'll go back, re-enable the menu, and hit escape. And there we go. We have all of the elements shown. And you can even see them being rendered in because the speed of Smile Game Builder at this point is a little slower when I'm doing that much event work. It's not too terrible, but it is kind of noticeable. Now we have all of these images here, and each one of them are about 84 by 84 pixels. This box is 100 by 100, and when I move the arrow keys, it will move and switch my characters. And I thought it was kind of funny. I added some little familiars in here for some of them because I imagine some games you'll have characters that have their own little pets. You can't see where my keys are going, but what I can tell you is if I keep hitting up, I'm not going up and I'm not going left. So all the logic I just showed you enables this kind of menu to display. If I hit the escape key, it'll reset back to where I started. Or if I hit the space bar, it'll trigger that confirm event, and that would allow you to interject your own code so you can react to a selection. I will be making all of the code of this menu available once this tutorial is posted. Even though I will be doing a part 2 to further explain some of the other elements, you'll be free to download this from the MakerBase SGB project so you can test it out on your own. Also, I do make these tutorials usually because somebody else asks me how to do something in Smile Game Builder. It's unlikely that I'm going to use a menu like this in my game anytime soon, but I hope that it'll be useful to you and the community. If you find this useful, please let me know. Like and subscribe. Look me up on the Discord channel. I love to hear feedback, and I love to hear what's working and what's not working for you. I also work with a lot of really great people, so please check out my description below for some links and references to other cool people out there in the SGB and the pixel art community. That's all for this Mottzy Minutes. Keep an eye out for the Mottzy Minutes Part 2 of the menus, where I'll show you exactly how to get this character rendering to work alongside the menu that I just described. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.